Hello, everyone.
Yep.
Thank you for joining us at the One UN Outreach webinar on talent with disabilities. We will just give it another minute as people join. Welcome, welcome. Yes, hello. Feel free to send some hearts, some highs, maybe write in the chat. Where are you joining from today? Welcome to this webinar. We're so glad you were able to join us. Florida, Nairobi, Nepal, India, Bangladesh, Philippines, Geneva, Chad, Jordan, seeing Portugal, Panama, Ethiopia. It's jumping up on my screen. Zimbabwe, Nairobi. I love it. Canada, great. I have people from all over the world. Bolivia, Ivory Coast, hello. Afghanistan, hello. Togo, nice to have you with us. Hello, Russia. Hello, Pakistan and Switzerland and France and Ghana. Hello, everyone. So let's get started with our webinar officially. Welcome to the One UN Outreach webinar on talent with disabilities. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are joining us in the world today. My name is Keshet Bachan. I am an HR team lead at UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. And I specialize in building respectful, value-driven workplace cultures with a focus on trust, belonging, and respect. I led UNDP's first organization-wide strategy on advancing a safe and respectful workplace. And so that is the focus of my work: civility, transparency, and a culture of inclusion. It's a pleasure to welcome you all today. And this session is really designed to give you an inside look into how the UN is evolving our strategies to strengthen accessibility and inclusion, and what this means in practice for people working for our agencies and across the UN system. Today, you will hear personal journeys, reflections from the field, and concrete insights from colleagues who are involved in shaping this work every day. So whether you are aspiring to join the UN, or you're navigating your early career, or simply passionate about the topic of disability inclusion, our conversation today offers inspiration, real experiences, and a candid look at what it means to build a workplace where everyone can belong and thrive. We are fortunate to have 4 excellent panelists with us, each bringing their unique perspective to building a more inclusive United Nations. Let me introduce them. Our first panelist will be Christy Rancière from UNODC, the Office on Drugs and Crime, and she is the youth focal point for UNODC. She works to mainstream youth participation and build partnerships with youth-led and youth-focused organizations, drawing on her deep experience in engaging youth in education and electoral contexts. Next, we have Dr. Mina Mojtahedi. She's a disability inclusion team lead at the UN Secretariat. She supports a system-wide implementation of the United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy, which is a strategy that is relevant for all the UN entities. And she brings extensive expertise across human rights, humanitarian action, and disability advocacy. She also has a distinguished background as a professional athlete, coach, and former president of Finland's Paralympic Committee. We are also joined by Bethany Kate Lewis, who's an international human rights lawyer and global health professional. She co-chairs the World Health Organization's Embracing Disability Affinity Group, and leads their work on health equity at the UHC 2030 Secretariat, collaborating across governments, civil society, youth, and UN agencies. And finally, we have Farhat Yusupjanov, Regional Coordinator for Ivy 2026, who is based with United Nations Volunteers, Regional Office in Bangkok. His experience across UNICEF Kazakhstan, UNDP's Istanbul Regional Hub's AI Lab, and UN volunteer assignments gives him a rich insight into early career pathways into the UN system. So with that said, we will jump to our first panelist, Bethany Kate Lewis, and we will present her with a question and have her tell us a little bit more about her work. So Bethany Kate, the World Health Organization's affinity group has become a really strong model for shifting organizational culture. What are the strategies that you have found more impactful working with an affinity group in building a really employee-led movement for inclusion across such a large technical organization like the WHO? And thinking about the path forward, what is the vision for the next phase in this work?
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Yes, I'm the co-chair of our Embracing Disability Affinity Resource Group at WHO. And so we are a voluntary employee-led community, which is committed to fostering an inclusive, supportive, and accessible workplace for colleagues with disabilities and colleagues with caring responsibilities for dependents with disabilities. And we also welcome allies. So we work as a community to amplify diverse lived experiences, strengthen organizational awareness, and promote disability inclusion across WHO. And our real aim is to foster a workplace where disability inclusion is not an afterthought, but a shared responsibility and a source of strength. So building an inclusive culture isn't just good for our workforce. It is also critical to WHO's mandate to represent, understand, and serve diverse populations worldwide. From our experience, our most successful and impactful activities as an affinity group have been around empowering individuals to share their stories, balance grassroots energy with leadership support, and connect colleagues across departments and regions. And one strategy that has been particularly effective is also creating opportunities for individuals to share their lived experiences and to be able to participate in kind of our communications materials through our online kind of community, through our intranet and through our events, to be able to really elevate these stories and kind of the diverse challenges and systemic barriers as well that our workforce can face, so that we can make sure organizational practices have a chance of accommodating and reflecting the spectrum of experiences within our workforce. We've also found that balancing grassroots energy with leadership support is really key. The group's energy and authenticity come from our workforce, but having leaders champion the group also gives it a really good sense of credibility, visibility, and the resources to actually make tangible change. So our group has wide representation across WHO, including different departments, levels, and engagement with different regions. And this really helps us to break down silos, allowing us to bring cross-disciplinary expertise to the table and ensuring that everyone can act as champions in their own circles of influence and amplify impact across the organization. Collaboration is another critical part of what we do. We work very closely with our WHO Staff Association, our HR department, our staff health and wellbeing services, and also our disability team within WHO, for example, so that we're constantly learning from our community around lived experiences and able to feed directly into workforce planning, organizational practices, and also WHO programs. And finally, our monthly meetings also focus on creating a safe, psychologically supportive space. We know that people need to feel comfortable bringing their whole selves to work, be comfortable asking questions and sharing challenges without fear. And so it is a very key and core component to the way that we do things within the affinity group. So we have some really exciting things on the table for 2026, and our priority as a group will be moving towards improving WHO's underscore, including by encouraging the embedding of disability inclusion into long-term workforce planning and decision-making. Visibility matters, but it is only meaningful when paired with influence. So our goal here is not only to be seen, but is also to ensure that persons with disability are included in the processes that shape hiring, development, leadership, and organizational culture within WHO and the broader UN system. Inclusion must be operational, measurable, and supported by the systems that enable it. We'll also be continuing to strengthen leadership driven by lived experience, which is really important to us. So persons with disabilities should not only be consulted, but we should also have formal seats at the decision-making tables and a role in shaping strategies and priorities for the organization. Lived experience is expertise, and I think that's really important to remember. And lived experience must inform policy, program design, and cultural change. We're really proud to already be working with WHO leadership to really advance this shift as well in our organization. Excitingly, this year we also delivered the first ever Disability Affinity Group survey on disability with the support of our WHO Staff Association. And this is a really big milestone in understanding representation, experience, and accessibility within WHO. The next phase will be to continue efforts to understand how to expand this evidence base and really meaningfully integrate disability data into workforce planning so barriers can be identified and addressed proactively and with precision. And we will also be working as a group to broaden pathways for professional growth and examine recruitment pathways, which is really important to us as a group. This means exploring opportunities to expand mentorship, development, and leadership openings for staff with disabilities, while also examining and dismantling recruitment barriers. So our goal is really to look at how we can investigate and build on equitable talent pipelines into WHO so that persons with disabilities can enter, develop, thrive, and lead. And finally, our last priority for 2026 will be about continuing supporting WHO's commitment to making accessibility a core competency of the organization. So we shouldn't rely on just accessibility advocacy. Accessibility really needs to be built into how we design workplaces, technology, training, meetings, communications, and leadership practices. This is how inclusion becomes a habit and a core way of working in the organization and not just an exception. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bethany Kate. A lot of really rich insights there. Particularly grabbed my attention, the survey that you did. We did something similar at UNDP. We had listening circles, people with disabilities, and it's really important avenue, as well as the affinity group, to really surface those lived experiences, make sure that we're not just consulting, but co-designing and really bringing people with those lived experiences into our processes and our decision making. So really great work from the World Health Organization. Thank you so much. And leading on from that, I will invite Christy Rancière to the stage. And she will take us through something similar, but from a youth perspective. So I know that UNODC's youth programs really bring together a young group of people from around the world in order to share their experiences and bring that perspective to the table. I think especially important in UN organizations where our young talent is not as pipelines are not as strong as some of our more senior talent. So what have you learned about creating environments, either virtual or in person, that support different communication styles, processing needs, forms of participation that are relevant or unique to young people?
Thank you so much, Keisha. And overall, thank you very much for inviting me here. to participate on behalf of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. I really believe these kinds of conversations are critical to make sure that we have environments that support people from diverse backgrounds, and that includes persons with disabilities. As mentioned previously, I am the youth focal point at UNODC, where I support a number of our ongoing youth-focused and youth-led projects and programs. So my job involves working with and for youth globally. As part of my role, I advocate for the meaningful inclusion of young people in decision-making processes and in all parts of the program and project cycle. And this, of course, includes disabilities, youth with disabilities and persons with disabilities. I think perhaps more than previous generations, there seems to be less stigma around having a disability, and there seems to be more openness from young people to ensure that people of all ages, abilities, regions can actively contribute to policy projects and programs. And I think this is really important and has been a changer and a shift generationally. An example of this was this past year. My team, we developed an internal guide for UNODC personnel on meaningful youth engagement. And in order to make sure that this project was in fact meaningful, we worked with youth from over 60 youth from 25 countries to review and validate the document. One thing that came up again and again was that young people were saying that persons with disabilities cannot be left out. And if we're going to be inclusive of youth, we also need to make sure that we're inclusive of persons with disabilities. So this means that a number of the recommendations in the document were meant accessible recommendations for everyone. And some of these examples included sending out material ahead of time, so that way neurodiverse youth have sufficient time to review the documents, ensuring that there's a specific contact person for accommodation and protection support while carrying out activities with and for youth, providing real-time captioning or interpretation, ASL interpretation services where possible, and then using effective communication. You know, these things include shorter sentences, concrete visual aids, and making sure that the information shared was more user-friendly. In cases like having the materials ahead of time, this is something that's not just helpful for persons with disabilities, but for all people. In terms of closed captioning, again, this is helpful for people from multilingual settings and who may need support in other ways. So oftentimes, these things that are considered perhaps a bit more accessible or supportive are not just supportive for persons with disabilities, but supportive for all persons to hopefully access, work with, and support decision-making processes. One example of this was we held side events at the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime during one of the conference of the parties. At the event, we were able to have young people join virtually from all over the world through a Teams meeting, while there were over 100 people in the room, including ambassadors and high-level speakers. One of the young people who was in the room came up to me shortly before and said, you know, I have an auditory disorder. I can't hear properly. Is there any way we can get closed captioning on the screen? And so we were able to do that in a very easy way because we had a Teams meeting. And so this was something to make sure that it was inclusive for youth joining online, but also people in the room with disabilities. And I see this really partnership in providing support both ways. Sometimes there's a misconception that providing accessible spaces, both virtually and online, can be very costly, but there are often these small changes that can be done to make spaces more meaningful and accessible for everyone, youth, persons with disabilities, and persons from diverse backgrounds as well. At the end of the day, when we have more accessible spaces, it means that our work can address the needs of all people better. And this is what really we're striving for at the end of the day. Just to highlight as well. Oh, sorry, Kisha, do you have something else to add? Okay, I can continue. Thank you. Just also to add, we have a number of projects, including our work on the Global Resource on Anti-Corruption Education, or our GRACE initiative, that has a youth-led board that includes persons with disabilities specifically, and has specific youth-led tools that have been shaped by persons with disabilities. And so I wanted to give them a shout out for the excellent work that they're doing to contribute. Anyways, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really great points. I think, it's important for us to talk a little bit about accessibility and reasonable accommodations. And as you say, sometimes those reasonable accommodations, maybe they used to have a cost implications, but nowadays you can have closed captions, right? You can have AI that comes in and helps in some of those situations with accessibility and with reasonable accommodation. Doesn't always have a cost implication. Thank you so much, Christy. I really appreciate your inputs. I will turn now to Mina from the EOSG Disability Inclusion Team. And we brought up the issue of reasonable accommodation, which are particularly important throughout the employee life cycle, but also in recruitment. And Christy gave us some great examples of how that can be made more accessible. But speaking of recruitment, I know that as a coordinator of the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, the strategy has been really effective in contributing to employment of persons with disabilities in the UN. Where have you seen the most progress? And perhaps share some examples with us around that.
Thanks, Kesha, and thanks so much for inviting me to speak here. It's great to see so many people online interested in this, and I hope there are many people with disabilities who are interested. Well, actually, it looks like many are already working in the UN, but hopefully there are many more looking to work in the UN, and hopefully this will give some inspiration. So thanks for the introduction. Indeed, my name is Mina Mojdahedi, and I am the Disability Inclusion Team Lead at the Executive Office of the Secretary General. And our team here in this office, we have a small team that coordinates the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, as you mentioned, Kesha. And just in case many participants are not familiar with the strategy, I just want to give a little bit of an overview, and then I'll get to your question. So the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy was launched by the Secretary General in 2019, and it was really a result of a recognition both by external stakeholders and partners, as well as by the Secretary General and within the UN, that the UN really needs to do more for inclusion of persons with disabilities. A lot was already being done, but in a more consistent and systematic way. So the strategy was launched with the intention of transformative and lasting change on disability inclusion across the entire UN system. And what we mean by the UN system is, every single UN organization that you can think of, which many of you will already be familiar with or are already working in. And then also the UN country teams, so the resident coordinator system. And many of you are from countries where there definitely are country teams. So the strategy has 4 core areas, and they're very much interconnected also with employment. So I just want to give a bit of an overview of the strategy. So there's an area on leadership and strategic planning. There's an area on inclusiveness, which is really about consultation and accessibility that's necessary for the consultation. There's a core area on programming, which is more the external facing part of the UN. So the work that the UN does all over the world to advance sustainable development or humanitarian assistance or peace and security or human rights. And then the 4th core area is around organizational culture, which my co-panelists here have already raised is so important for employment. And with the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, that core area is really around human resource policies, about capacity of staff to understand inclusion of persons with disabilities, and then also around like communication, so both internal and external communication on disability inclusion and making sure it's inclusive and accessible, because that's so important for raising awareness and bringing visibility to the issues. When the strategy was launched, the Secretary General really outlined that employment of persons with disabilities is a priority, and it is definitely, within the context of UN 80 and the challenges that the UN is currently undergoing. It's still maintained as a priority that we definitely want to be more inclusive to recruit persons with disabilities and retain and support those career paths. And the Secretary General has said that he wants the UN to be an employer of choice. So how does the strategy contribute to that? The strategy is a roadmap for an organization, a UN organization to become, or a UN country team to become inclusive. And there are a number of indicators which are requirements that pertain to employment. Firstly, around human resource policies, a requirement is that the policies explicitly state, are non-discrimination policies, and would, include affirmative action for employment of persons with disabilities. Related to this is a very explicit area of the strategy, which Kesha mentioned, reasonable accommodation, which many of you will know are workplace adjustments to ensure that staff members with disabilities are able to, participate in the workplace equally and fulfill their responsibilities equally. So it's about the work, but it's also about just being an equal member of the workforce. And then, of course, accessibility, and that's on an individual basis. But then more broadly on accessibility, the strategy also has requirements around all forms of accessibility, whether it's physical, information, communication accessibility, digital accessibility. And we have an international sign interpreter here. That is one aspect of accessibility. And there are requirements around this in the strategy as well. And then, as mentioned by by other panelists, also organizational culture is very important. So there is a requirement for UN organizations to develop learning materials on inclusion of persons with disabilities and training and roll these out and to make these mandatory. So in terms of progress, how are we doing on all of these? Well, not all of these. I'll give some examples. Well, firstly, I want to say that the strategy itself overall has been a catalyst for disability inclusion across the whole UN system. And we recently had an independent evaluation done, which really highlighted that it has been a game changer, but that there's still a long way to go. But just as an example, our team does monitoring and coordination of the strategy, and our baseline data shows that of all the UN organizations that reported in 2019, the UN was meeting 16% of the strategy's requirements in 2019. And now jump to 2024, which is our most recent data. The UN as a system is now meeting 42% of the strategy's requirements. So it's a massive change, but that said, it's less than half of the requirements. So we still have a lot of work to do. But the panelists here have been speaking a lot about the things that that they're doing in their entities and the changes that they've seen, and it's all to do with their good work. And the strategy provides the framework to enable that, and we really see that in the data that's happened. Then more specifically, I think an important example also of where there's been progress and where there's a better awareness and institutionalization of disability inclusion is that one of the requirements is that UN organizations should have their own disability-specific policies or strategies on disability inclusion. And in 2019, only 10% of UN entities, so UN organizations, had these disability-specific policies or strategy, and jumped to 2024, and we're at 54%. This is a massive change, and it means that 54% of UN organizations are committed to inclusion of persons with disabilities in all areas of their work, and that should also include employment. And in terms of employment, we see some really great examples where in some entities, the strategies have even set targets for the percentage of persons with disabilities that they want to have within their organization. We also see some really good practices around centralizing reasonable accommodation funds. And what that means is that when it's a centralized system, it's less dependent on the manager's decision or understanding, but rather there's a centralized sort of process to make those funds available when needed. I mean, Keshet mentioned we don't always need funds, but sometimes we do. And then on accessibility, I was just checking our data, and in 2024, our data shows that 50%, so half of all the UN organizations now have policies on accessibility. That said, one of the tricky parts where we really need to do more is the implementation of accessibility, and it requires funds. So that's an area where we're still a little bit struggling. So we have the awareness, we have the policies, and getting to the next level is still a challenge. I do want to mention something on the learning, like the training on disability inclusion. So this year, there was a big change within the UN Secretariat where we made an online disability inclusion training, and it includes a training on UNDIS, on the strategy, mandatory for all Secretariat staff. Now, HR professionals have different opinions about mandatory training. Sometimes we feel like it's not effective. There's so many of them. But I have to say that we have received so much positive feedback about this. So many people have come to say, I just wasn't aware, and this is so important now, and the training is really getting at like improving people's understanding, like staff's understanding about what disability is, and it has made a difference. So, and there are many other UN organizations too that have really good learning materials and are rolling this out in a mandatory way. So just some examples, but I've already talked quite a lot. So back to you, Keshet.
Thank you so much, Mina. No, that's great. And I was just looking at our own numbers yesterday at UNDP, where we have the same mandatory course. And we have a workforce of 23,000 people, and over 18,000 have already taken the course, so vast majority, which is great. So thank you so much for mentioning that. And also, since we're speaking of pathways into the UN and being an employer of choice, I'll move on to Parhat, because I think this is where you can really come in with your own experiences as someone who has focused on disability inclusion in your UN roles, even though they've never officially been about disability inclusion. Kind of what are the lived experiences that have shaped accessibility improvements across the organizations where you've worked? How has your personal journey influenced the inclusiveness of the environment around you, even from positions who aren't officially wearing a disability inclusion hat?
All right. Thank you so much for giving me the floor. Good morning, everyone. If you are in Americans, good afternoon if you are in Europe or African countries, and good evening and good night if you are in Asia and the Pacific states. So my journey into the United Nations actually started with a very simple belief. I truly thought that the UN would be the most inclusive place in the world, a place where I would finally stop explaining about my disability, where accessibility would be natural, automatic, and of course guaranteed. This is because I've been very much involved in the disability movement when I worked in Kazakhstan and even beyond. So when I was struggling with different institutions, governments, the government structures, maybe private sector, I would always reference UN guidelines, UN principles, UN conventions. I would tell them that you are violating like UN principles, guidelines. And of course, I would just believe that UN is the most accessible place in the world, the most inclusive one. But life likes irony. And as I understood, irony loves me. So when I joined the UN, I discovered something unexpected. So I just realized that inclusion was not automatic. In fact, sometimes it was not even noticed. And that discovery actually hit me very hard. It felt like culture shock, like professional shock, and like emotional shock all at once. Imagine it's a very hard blow for me. Well, for example, let me tell you one story. Like on my first days, my colleagues would walk up to me, like start talking to me, and of course, they would walk away, and they were friendly, nice, and very warm, but they just forgot about a tiny detail. They assumed that since they already introduced themselves a few days ago, they don't need to say their names when they come and talk to me. And it really confused me because I didn't even know whether I'm talking to the right person about the right things. And it happened again and again. And I just decided to take a leadership here, and I conducted a training for our colleagues on how to help support and of course correctly speak to and correctly assist persons with disabilities. And at the same time, I could actually present them the UNICEF DPAS, which is the UNICEF Disability Inclusion Policy and Strategy. So I could learn a lot as well by preparing to that training. So, and we had this training with a lot of humor and fun. So humor helped me survive, and actually honesty helped me grow at UNICEF. So as was said before joining UNV, I've been working with UNICEF as a partnerships analyst. And the thing which I remember about it, I helped create one of the first Braille materials on disaster preparedness for visually impaired children. So I remember touching the pages. I remember feeling pride with my fingers. It was like not just information, it was safety and format children could actually use. So at that time, I realized, oh, inclusion is something you can touch and you can feel. So later in Istanbul, when I was working as a partnerships analyst already at the SDGA lab, I could find time to help make security trainings more accessible for all, including persons with disabilities. And it was not because someone asked me, "Oh, hey, can you please help us with that?" And it was because I knew that it is important because when I did my master's degree in the United States, I was left behind in the dormitory on the 14th floor in the middle of the night when the dormitory had a fire and all the students just ran away, and I was left behind. It was a negative experience for me because I didn't know where to go and how to find the exit. But at the same time, it was a positive one for me because I realized that actually persons with disabilities are not on paper, but in reality are very much likely to be left behind during disasters. So I just decided to do what I can to support the United Nations so that other people do not need to experience the same way as I experienced in the US. So as I told already, I arrived in the UN expecting perfection. I imagined a place where accessibility would be already fully integrated, where I would be the one learning from the system. But instead, actually, I realized that the system is learning a lot from me. I am currently the honorary regional coordinator in the United Nations Volunteers with a Disability, and that actually changed the dynamic completely. So, for example, my supervisor started preparing materials differently. They became more accessible, more thoughtful. And it was not because it was her job or I asked her, can you please make it more accessible? No, but because she grew, she cared, and because inclusion became personal to her. So, and that for me was one of the most powerful feelings. Like when I watch people choose inclusion, not just out of obligation, out of some responsibility, but out of respect. This is one of the most precious things which I can find in life. Today, I support countries across the entire Asia Pacific region. So we help them plan and conduct International Volunteer Year 2026 activities. And it is a meaningful work. It's challenging work. It's, anyways, rewarding work. And it reminds me every day that inclusion is not one-time achievement. It's a living practice, moving target, I would say, a daily decision. So people often ask me, what was the hardest part of joining the United Nations as a person with a disability? And for me, it wasn't an inaccessible documents or inaccessible buildings, inaccessible meetings, or inaccessible restrooms. Not at all. For me, it was realizing that the UN is not yet the place I believe it was, and which was more challenging to accept that maybe I was brought to the United Nations, not to enjoy perfect inclusion, but maybe to help build it. This is very difficult, but I accepted it, and now I feel much better, and hopefully the system feels better too. So I learned that by being here, openly, proudly, unapologetically, I just give the system a new perspective. I show colleagues what inclusion looks like in reality, in real life, not in policy, not in theory, not in their concept notes or in their one pagers or two pagers, I don't know, but in a human being, in me, like sitting in the same room with them and using some cool assistive technology, some phone which talks to him, or like some braille which just dots enabling a person to read. So inclusion is not something we wait for. It's, I would say, something we create interaction by interaction, document by document, training by training. So if my presence helps at least one person with a disability or without a disability um, to feel that the United Nations is the place where he or she wants to be and he or she is welcome to be, then I think every culture shock and every moment are worth it. So all these awkward conversations with someone whose name I still didn't know, for example, or every day which is spent pushing the system to grow and watching it actually growing. And I came to the United Nations believing it was perfect. Today, I stay in the United Nations because I know that it can be better, and I'm here to help it make it so. So thank you very much for giving me the floor. It
Thank
was
you
a great
so
pleasure
much,
to
Farhad.
share. Yeah.
Very inspiring. I really appreciate your viewpoint. Tobias, perhaps we can spotlight all of our panelists together. So Farhad, stay with us. And we will take some questions now. We've got almost 20 minutes to take some questions. So thank you so much. And if you have any questions you would like, please put them in the Q&A. We will try to answer as many as as many as we can. And I will send the first question to Christy because it has to do with youth with disabilities. And so the question is, how do we ensure that youth with disabilities are not just what a group that we consult with, but really a group that we integrate into our workforce? What does that look like at UNODC?
Thanks so much. And I think this is a really important question. As one of the colleagues from EOSG elaborated, Mina, we have now policies in place that allow us to understand who actually is a part of our workforce are people with disabilities. And I think previously that wasn't even a question asked. So this has been like a really good first step to understanding what that looks like. That being said, making sure that if you are a young person with disabilities, that you are applying to these opportunities that you see fit, that you are making sure that you're credentials really match what's going on in the job posting and you do your best to try. I myself am a young person with disabilities, and it's been like I've had my ups and downs navigating the UN system. I think one of the things that is really important to make sure to understand too is that internships, unfortunately, at this moment are uncompensated at the UN Secretariat, and there are opportunities for paid internships in different parts of the UN system, and that's very good. But also, different contract modalities have different abilities to have healthcare and health insurance attached to them. So, if you are someone who may need additional support through a variety of different means, understanding and looking ahead and knowing what that looks like as part of the contract modality you're applying to is really important. And I think that there needs to be some transparency and understanding around that and what that can mean for your future. But just to say, as there's been reiterated, we are making progress, but I can also see that there are ways that we can improve and really
Always.
continue to do better. Yeah.
Of course. And just to say, UNDP does pay interns, and I will be hiring an intern to focus on disability inclusion in my team next week. So I'm plugging that here, and please apply. We have another question that I'd like to give Bethany Kate. In the context of working with, an affinity group or a group of people with disabilities who come together, kind of what are the kind of outputs, training, materials, sensitization, what are the ways in which this group really impacts or influences the way things are done in our organizations?
Yeah, thanks so much. I think that's a great question, and I think as we're kind of discussing here today, it's really important to acknowledge that we're all on a journey here. We're not at the end of the journey. This is a journey. The UN is a human institution, and like humanity, we are on the path to better equity and inclusion when it comes to persons with disabilities. I am also a person with disabilities, invisible disability within the UN system. And I just want to acknowledge as well what has been reflected here today, which is sometimes it can be really, really hard. It is hard going to have to turn up and to continue to do the advocacy work, but also live that work as well when you have barriers to overcome and to engage with on a daily basis. And so those that are going into the UN system, I think it's important that you do have that lens when you are considering the path forward. There is great highlights, but there is also that other side. But together we continue to work towards this journey of better equity inclusion within our organizations and the UN system as a whole. In terms of the disability affinity group, so the answer is we participate in all of it. So wherever we see an opportunity to progress, whether it is through an event, whether it is to engage in training or update recruitment processes, look at talent and how we kind of make talent pipelines into WHO and the UN system. We are really responsible for integrating that lived experience component. And a lot of our work comes from the experience within our community of hitting those barriers and those challenges in the day-to-day. And so they, through that experience, bring that to our group, and then we put that on the agenda to progress forward. So it really is through that lived experience lens that we are uncovering these issues, uncovering these problems, and being able to work as a community, within our community, but also within broader WHO to further progress the breaking down of the barriers and the systemic issues that our community has uncovered.
Thank you so much, Bethany Kate. We have quite a few questions on entries or pathways, opportunities for entering the UN. Bahar, can you speak maybe a little bit about your own experience entering the UN? You spoke a little bit about what you thought it would be like, but take us through your lived experience around the actual recruitment process. Were there any accommodations that you asked for? Was there any education that you needed to do? How is that experience for you, and how does it continue to be as you move between organizations?
Oh, okay. Thanks so much for your question. Actually, I started my UN journey not with UNICEF, but as an intern at UNSCAP here in Bangkok. So I returned back to Bangkok, but still, but now to a different UN entity. So like the process is different, I believe, for different organizations. Like there are some vacancies which are open only for some DOAs which are only open for persons with disabilities, because like in UEP you may see that it says DOA reserved for persons with disabilities. So in that case, you are very much open to provide as many details as possible about your disability and about any other things which you would like to. But I was mostly applying for positions open for everyone. That's why I would like to say I just mentioned in my application. I always mention in my applications that I have a disability, so that the recruitment people know about it. But I didn't really ask for additional accommodations. I just asked for like a permission to have sunglasses on, for example, or to use Microsoft Teams instead of Zoom. These are just small things which I was asking for. Other than that, I was just honest and open that I have a disability, and I'm here to be interviewed by you.
Right. Yes, and I think that's an important opening for us, and maybe Mina can speak to that a little bit more. We spoke about having a centralized reasonable accommodation fund as a good practice, or as a minimum standard as part of the strategy, but having maybe a reasonable accommodation guidance. What does that look like for candidates? How does that change from entity to entity in terms of what we provide, how to ask for it? What are we seeing across the system in terms of making the entry points easier for people with disabilities?
Thanks, Kesha. I'm not sure I'm best positioned to answer that. I think that's a very sort of entity-specific practice. But maybe just some, examples that I do know of generally, and then perhaps the colleagues from at the entity level are better placed to.
You mentioned affirmative action in the Secretariat. Perhaps you can also give an example specific to the Secretariat, because not all UN entities have the same kind of practices.
Right. So I'm not speaking on behalf of the Secretariat.
Okay.
The Secretariat is like, over 50 UN entities. But of course, there is, an Office of Human Resources, which would be a great resource. Perhaps we can follow up with them. But just to say, generally what we mean by affirmative action is that recognizing that staff with disabilities are underrepresented across the UN, and we want to be able to provide equal opportunities. So a reasonable accommodation is one means to do that. I mean, first of all, I mentioned the non-discrimination policies are very important, just to state that. And actually, the UN rules and regulations were just recently updated to explicitly state that persons with disabilities require accessibility and reasonable accommodation. So it was pertaining to employment. So this is great. And we know that the Secretary General Bulletin on Accessibility and Employment is also being updated right now in order to. So this is at the policy level. The Secretariat does have a guideline on reasonable accommodation. So that's for the use of all Secretariat entities. And but then, at an entity level, many do have those reasonable accommodation funds. We've been working towards looking at how we can have a more institutional mechanism that would support all secretariat entities. But again, I think the Office of Human Resources is better positioned to speak to this. You know, in the executive office, we really just monitor and coordinate. But I think in terms of enabling entry points to the UN, we recognize it's challenging, and we recognize that, especially I would say in developing contexts, people with disabilities face a lot of barriers to access education, but and progress in education, and then also the employment opportunities that would kind of build your CV in order to be competitive for the UN. I mean, I use a wheelchair. I've wanted to work in the international sector, my whole career, and was outright told by not from the UN. It was more. I was in academia at the time, was outright told that, well, we don't think that you can do this job because you use a wheelchair. And so, I set out to figure out how I can, build my CV in order to show, well, actually I can. And it was very challenging. International NGOs often require that you have, a certain kind of work experience. And it's the same with the UN. So we know that there are these sort of structural barriers that don't necessarily stem from a UN policy or something, but more of like the opportunities that a person with a disability has had within their context to gain the I say build CV, but gain the skills and the professional development that would make them competitive for the UN. So, that said, we have Parkat here, and UN volunteers, I think, had a fantastic program where they really recruited, I don't remember the number, but it was a lot, like a few hundred persons with disabilities. I don't know if I'm getting the number right, but it was significant. And a lot of them were working at the country level. The benefit of that was that, and I think Parkat, was speaking to this, what I'm about to say, and I have this experience myself. The UN as a system, it takes time for it to change, and we do need, the sort of influx of people with disabilities to pave the way to force the system to change and figure out how to change. And unfortunately, that does mean potentially, and hopefully not for very many, but those challenging experiences where you're really just educating everybody around you on what needs to be done. But I really hope that, just like Parkat, I think a great example, he recognizes that this changes the system and it enables easier experiences, better experiences for others who come after us. I also want to say that, kind of in line with the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, one really important way to be able to reach persons with disabilities. I mean, this webinar is a great example, but we also see that many organizations or country teams do outreach to organizations of persons with disabilities. Like, we need to be able to communicate about the opportunities where people with disabilities are. And those organizations, the disability movement is one great way to do that. Of course, it doesn't reach everybody, but it's a really important way. Persons with like those organizations also have a lot of expertise and can inform our work, not just from programmatic aspects, but in terms of what do we need to do for accessibility, what do we need to consider for perhaps building talent pipelines or skills development in order to. So there's a lot to be done, but I think the fact that we're talking about it here is an indication that there's better awareness. And we're on track. But I want to recognize what Parkat was saying. It is, and I recognize that experience. I've had very similar experiences where it's a work in progress, and we still have a lot of work ahead.
Right. Yeah. And thank you so much for bringing up outreach efforts like this webinar. I know that UNDP also participates in career fairs that are focused specifically on people with disabilities. I expect some of our other UN partners here do as well. So if you are seeking an entry point into the UN as a person with disabilities, know that we want to hear from you. And that you should go to one of those career fairs. You should reach out to us. And I think at least all the participating organizations here absolutely offer reasonable accommodations of various kinds to ensure that you can compete on an equal footing with everyone else. So I'd really like to thank everyone. We are at time for joining me today. Thank you for the panelists for sharing their insights and experiences so much, and for everyone who joined us. We hope this conversation has given you a deeper understanding of how the UN, different agencies, and the system as a whole is advancing disability inclusion, how each and every one of you can be part of this effort and joining us in this effort. And we look forward to continuing this dialogue and building workplaces and opportunities that serve everyone. So thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening from wherever you joined us. Thank you so much, everyone.